Are we really camping? Clara asked for the third time. Do you really trust any of the accommodations in that town? Ludmilla replied. Well, no, Clara admitted, but sleeping out here does not seem much safer. The place that Ludmilla had selected was a ridge which rose a few hundred meters distant from the highway, approximately 2 kilometers from the walls of Facet town. The flat, wind-swept hilltop had a cliff on one side overlooking the lights of the distant buildings below, and both north and south approaches of the highway could be clearly observed from their vantage. The carriages were arranged in a perimeter on one side of the camp, and the servants in their entourage were busily working to erect tents and barricades according to Ludmilla's directions as she oversaw the establishment of a defensible position. The 4 young noblewomen stood looking out over the cliff towards the town as they discussed amongst themselves. It will be, once we are done entrenching ourselves, Ludmilla said. Those prices were ridiculous, as well. I could have us living out here for a year with what they charge for a week. I don't think any of us would have liked to stay in town anyways. I can still taste whatever that was in the air. At least here we command our surroundings. The 12 footmen and 6 drivers were divided into 3 watches to cover all the hours of the day. It was not unlike organizing a patrol, so when she started to issue instructions after their arrival, everyone had quickly deferred to Ludmilla's apparent expertise. The maids which had accompanied them had set about making the site more comfortable with mixed degrees of enthusiasm. Some viewed it with an excited sense of adventure, while others were reluctant at the idea of sleeping out in the wilderness. Leanne and Florian were a part of the latter group, having been raised in their luxurious city manners and traveling in similarly comfortable conditions. Clara, who had been exposed to House Zaradnik since childhood, had at least been dragged out several times on childhood adventures over the years, though their present surroundings were markedly more dangerous than the impromptu romps with Ludmilla and their brothers through the well-managed vineyards and woodlands in Corlin Barony. These are the best footmen between your households, aren't they? Ludmilla said. We should be fine, they seem at least as proficient as the best of the city militia. 2 of the men patrolling the perimeter nearby straightened as her voice drifted over them. They are, Clara replied, but what if a mob is roused against us? Lady Shiltier sent 3 of her servants to accompany us as well, Ludmilla said. I'm confident that the footmen can fulfill their assignments. Lady Shiltier's servants will deal with any large, hostile groups should the need arise. She had spent the better part of the previous night speaking with Lady Shiltier about her new duties, and they had parted in the early hours in the morning. 3 shadow demons appeared at the foot of her bed shortly after, just as she was drifting off to sleep. Her talent allowed her to see them clearly even as they lurked in the darkness, and they wouldn't leave her alone. The unfamiliar and eerie presences had her give up on sneaking in an hour or 2 of rest before departing Erantal. So you really did tell her? Florian's amber eyes reflected the light of the campfire along with her apprehension. We were supposed to keep this out of the royal court's notice, weren't we? My liege will not be informing the rest of the royal court, Ludmilla reassured her. Not until we make our attempt at resolving this issue ourselves. We should be here for the next week or so, yes? Perhaps we can convince one or both of them by then. I guess. Leanne shifted in her mantle as they watched moonlight and shadows play over the forests enveloping the town. We did just show up uninvited to deliver the will of the House of Lords. Maybe time to digest things will make them more amenable, but I'm not optimistic. What will we do if? Seeing Ludmilla's raised hand, Leanne abruptly stopped speaking. What is it? Clara asked. There's a group of people coming up the road from the town. Ludmilla replied. They're at the base of the hill leading up to us. Clara, Leanne and Florian all turned their attention to the road. The sentries posted around the camp did not yet show any indication of having noticed the group approaching in the darkness. Footman, Ludmilla called. All the way at the perimeter of the camp, a tall man in the livery of House Wagner reacted to her voice. Even from their distance, he somehow knew exactly who had called him and strode directly towards her. Yes, Lady Camilla? He said with a slight bow. There are 4 coming up the road from the north, she said. Let the others know. The footman turned to peer out over the cliff down at the road, but confirmation of her claim did not enter his expression. He did not dispute her words, though. Heading out to the perimeter, he started to inform the other sentries, and soon the edge of the camp was abuzz with activity. 3 footmen stepped out onto the road, 2 held winged spears while the third raised a torch aloft in one hand, brandishing his warhammer in the other. The remaining 3 men on watch unlimbered their longbows and stood on the edge of the half-built perimeter. The maids and noble women were instructed to enter the safety of the carriages, but Ludmilla stopped them. "Wait," she said, "they look like children." "My lady," Leluvian spoke up at her words. "Even children can be dangerous, especially in Facet County." Heads turned to the half-elf maid with incredulous expressions. The driver nearby took her words to heart, however, and ushered them into the opened doors. Ludmilla retrieved her longbow from where it rested against one of the carriages, bracing it between her legs to string it. "Go on ahead," she told the others. "I'll take care of things outside." She picked up one of her quivers of arrows nearby and hooked it to its place on her kidney belt before heading off to wait against the carriage nearest to the road. Her fingers idly ran over the shaft of the arrow she had drawn from her quiver as she watched the children approach, but her expression soon changed from suspicion to concern. Ludmilla checked herself as she reflexively moved to help them, recalling Leluvian's words. Ever since they had entered Facet County, the disturbing sensation that permeated the villages and towns had put her constantly on her guard. The feeling from the town, especially, had been overpowering, causing her to physically retch when disembarking at Jacqueline Facet's manor. The other noble women seemed to have handled it better, but it still lent an antagonistic edge to their thoughts and words, making it a challenge to negotiate with both Campbell and Jacqueline Facet. She eyed the children as they approached. There was 1 boy and 3 girls. The girls seemed to be slowing their pace so that the boy who was shuffling along could keep up. They all had a disheveled appearance, but the boy was degrees worse. His clothing was soiled and he looked battered as he limped along. There was a clear injury where his shirt was stained with blood and stuck to his side. This couldn't be a ruse, could it? A convincing performance to make them drop their guard for an ambush from the trees? Ludmilla scanned their surroundings but saw no one. She had quickly come to learn that most who used the cover of darkness to conceal their presence tended to rely on it too much, often standing out in the open where darkness would conceal their forms. Her talent allowed her to see with perfect clarity regardless of lighting, so their doing so made them stand out conspicuously to her while they remained oblivious to the fact that they had been detected, as long as she did not give her awareness of them away. After one last scan of their surroundings, Ludmilla decided that they presented no threat. She turned and knocked on the door of the carriage which sheltered several of the maids. After a moment it opened, and Leluvian poked her head out. "Yes, my lady?" "There's an injured child coming," Ludmilla said. "What methods do we have available to treat him?" Leluvian's head disappeared back into the carriage and the murmur of voices could be heard as the maids within spoke between themselves. A moment later, her chambermaid's head reappeared. "There's a small chest of light healing potions, 24 vials in total," she reported. "There's also 2 wands of light cure wounds in case of emergencies." "A potion should be fine," Ludmilla said. "He looks severely injured, but he was able to walk all the way out here. Get some clean clothes ready for them, as well as warm food. You and your sister's work starts here." "Yes, my lady," Leluvian nodded. "We'll begin preparing right away." The carriage door closed and Ludmilla turned back to watch the children as they approached the footman on the road. After a brief exchange, the man with the torch turned to look over the carriages until their eyes met and he gave her a questioning look. Ludmilla nodded and the men brought the children up towards the perimeter of the campsite. The man with the torch put away his weapon and handed the torch over to his fellow, then trotted ahead over to her. "That one asked for you by name, Lady Camilla," he said, motioning to one of the girls in the group walking up the slope to the camp. "Did they say anything else?" Ludmilla asked. "No, my lady," he replied. "She immediately asked for you, and wouldn't say anything else. Did you know they were coming?" "I sent someone to retrieve one of them," she said, "but it looked like something happened before that. The maids will take care of them from here. The next watch should be ready to take over soon as well, so make sure the men on your watch get food and rest when they do." The footman bowed slightly and returned to his post. Ludmilla knocked on the door of the carriage again. "They're here," she said after Leluvian opened the door. "Get the girls cleaned up and changed, and bring out their meals." With the state of alarm lowered, the noble women returned to where they had been standing near the fire. "Why did children come out to us in the middle of the night?" Florian wondered. "They looked quite wretched from what I saw of them," all skin and bone and rags. Though she said this aloud, they all had a vague idea of the reasons from their passage through the county. The land was in a terrible state that anyone could recognize on sight, and, to those present with well-managed fiefs, it gave off a disgusting sensation bordering on being outright offensive. While the highway and the buildings nearest to it had been cleaned up and made to look festive and inviting, the people looked anything but. Common were sallow faces that did not look up at their surroundings. Men and women were not dressed to reflect the celebratory atmosphere that was suggested by the colorful flags that fluttered over the streets. The streets themselves were only frequented by adults and emaciated children who looked entirely uncared for. Wardensvale was poor and humble, but its people were well cared for, proud and resolute. The territories to the east near the city of Erantle had been arrayed in the same festive manner as the main thoroughfares in Facet County, but their people carried bright and lively expressions and were adorned in the colorful fashions of spring. The further west they traveled, the more it seemed that they were entering into a different world. The capital of Facet County, which lay closest to the border with Riestais, seemed to teeter on the edge of ruin. The shallow attempt to fool passers-by only had the effect of making things look even worse. Large population centers rose as a result of the industries that grew in the territories surrounding them. They represented the wealth and productivity of a domain, be it a minor fee managed by a member of the gentry, or a duchy ruled by royalty. Looking upon the sickening caricature that was Facet Town, Ludmilla could not imagine what course of action House Facet could have taken to turn it into the very image of destitution and helpless despair. To accomplish this, it would take far more effort than simply administering one's domain in a proper manner. "I sent for one of them," Ludmilla told them. "The boy was spying on our meeting with Lady Facet." You're not planning on doing something to him, I hope?" Florine looked at her fearfully with wide eyes. "I'm not exactly sure what you're thinking when you say that," Ludmilla frowned, "but it's not anything terrible. The chambermaids that accompanied me were originally from Facet County, so I'm relying on them to help paint a more complete picture of what is really going on here. They suggested that I find people willing to work with us to provide the information that we need. That boy was willing to infiltrate the guarded estate of a countess, so I thought he must know other things as well." There was a rustle through the grass behind them and Ludmilla turned to see Willuvian bringing 3 children towards them. They had been scrubbed pink and dressed in clean, white smocks, damp hair left loose to dry in the wind. Though rushed through their attentions, they still looked far improved compared to before. "How's the boy?" Ludmilla asked. "He's resting at the moment, my lady," Willuvian said. "His injuries were quite severe, several broken ribs, his breath was ragged and gurgling. The healing potion has already done its work, he should be fine when he awakens." The boy had walked all the way here with those injuries. He was far tougher than he looked. Her instructions to the shadow demon had not been thorough enough, as well. Ludmilla nodded, and Willuvian led them to a row of seats arranged around the fire opposite the noble women. The 3 of them looked back and forth uncertainly between the adults before one of the girls visibly resolved herself. "Are you Camilla?" she asked loudly, and Clara jumped. Leanne tried to hold back a laugh but it came out through her nose. The girl had ventured that the most prominent looking among them was who she was looking for. She backed away, glancing at Leanne, and sat down again with an uncertain look. Ludmilla appeared from the tents beyond them, carrying a silver tray in her hands. 2 other maids carried their own behind her. Together they held the trays in front of the girls and lifted the covers. Plates containing fresh bread, steamed vegetables and sweetened meats filled the air with their aroma. The girls visibly swallowed. "Let's leave them to their dinner," Leanne said with a smirk. "They should be less eager once their hunger is sated." The maids led the girls away to be seated around the campfire, where they hungrily dug into their meal. The 4 noble women were left alone together to continue their discussion, and Ludmilla continued surveying the town below. "It wasn't a nice thing, laughing like that," Clara shot Leanne a look. "A powerful countess of the mighty sorceress kingdom, jumping scared at little girls?" Leanne said. "You can't say that wasn't funny." Clara pouted as the others joined in Leanne's mirth, laughter rising over the wind and the dancing flames. Far away from the eyes of outsiders, the layers of courtly conduct fell away between them, replaced by the casual tone between friends. Well, as casual as one might be with their current circumstances, much of their conversation revolved around their work by necessity. Besides, I believe such initiative should be lauded, Lian continued. With a little bit of training, her naked ambition can be harnessed and refined towards productive ends. If there are no objections, I'd like to take her for one of my companies. You can't just steal girls off of the street, Lian, Florine said. Her parents must be worried sick. From the looks of it, I doubt she has any. Lian replied, her value is lost on this sorry excuse for a town. We should have some answers about what happened to them now, Ludmilla said. The one that brought them has returned as well. Tell us what happened. The three other noble women looked around themselves, confused over who she had addressed. A cold voice filtered through the night air before them. The boy ordered for retrieval encountered 3 men and a woman, who were struggling with the 3 human girls. He fought, presumably to free one of them. The matter was expedited. It is discourteous to conceal yourself from the others in this situation, Ludmilla said. Do not make them listen to a disembodied voice. Beyond the edge of the cliff, the shadow demon rose out of the darkness and floated before them. Even when not purposely concealing itself, its translucent form must have been difficult for the others to see with just the light of the campfire. This is one of the servants Lady Schultier sent with you? Clara eyed the dark figure warily. Yes, Ludmilla said, they are called shadow demons. Lady Schultier saw fit to have 3 of them accompany us to aid in our work. Demons? Florine turned pale. Wasn't there some disturbance last year in Riestise's capital involving some demon invasion? I'm the last person that would know about anything of the sort, Ludmilla replied. You should be well aware that humans are just a part of the sorceress kingdom, so, while we may be responsible for human subjects ourselves, acting as if we are still nobles of a human kingdom would be foolish. These shadow demons currently serve me, I serve Lady Schultier, Lady Schultier serves His Majesty. It's not so different from before, yes? Beside her, Clara nodded. After a moment, Lian and Florine slowly nodded as well. Ludmilla addressed the shadow demon once again. So these men, she asked, for what reason were they doing this? They were stealing them, it answered. The women blinked. The girls were struggling against their captors, the shadow demon explained at length. The boy opposed their actions. Facet's men, my lady, a voice from behind them said. Or someone working under their auspices. The children have the look of street waifs. If the homeless vanish from the streets, they will not be missed. The Lynam sisters came to stand near their mistress, and Leluvian continued speaking. Young girls are valuable, she said matter-of-factly, for various reasons. I would be surprised if they were not being taken away to be sold. The evidence of their neglect aside, they would all be considered pleasing in appearance to most. So they were slavers, then? Florine's mouth twisted. Probably not just slavers, Lady Gagne, Leluvian said. House Facet has their hand in other ventures as well. The same skills are used across many lines of this sort of work. I suspect we'll be discovering in detail what exactly they've been involved in over the next few days. Ludmilla looked towards the other noble women. But I still cannot understand how this all came to be. It's in flagrant defiance of the crown laws and these other laws of Riestise, in force since before the Erantal changed hands. Clara, Lian and Florine exchanged quick glances at her words. Lian was singled out by the others, and she met Ludmilla's gaze before letting out a sigh. What? Ludmilla frowned. I'm sorry. It's just. Lian let out a short laugh. It's just that I've never known a noble like you before. We've all seen each other through the years at a few functions, but we've never really spoken plainly, I guess. I've always thought Clara upright and austere, but you're far beyond even her. Or maybe it's a part of you that's rubbed off on her, considering how close you two are. Lian rubbed her chin, then looked up at the clear night sky. She let out a breath and met Ludmilla's gaze again. Okay, Lian said. Let's try it this way. Nobles are granted their authority, rights and privileges through the contract they hold with their liege. With that power, they are expected to fulfill their obligations to land and liege. Makes sense so far, right? Yes, of course, Ludmilla replied. Now, Lian asked her, what happens if they fail to meet their obligations? That would depend on what the circumstances are, wouldn't it? Ludmilla answered, bad harvests can happen, so one could appeal to have their tax obligations waived. Natural disasters, monster attacks, sickness and death, they can all affect how well one can meet their contractual obligations. Are you doing this on purpose? Leanne frowned. Doing what on purpose? Ludmilla frowned back. We had an audience with Campbell earlier today, then Jacqueline just now. You even puked in front of her manor after sensing all of the problems in this county. Do you think either of them are doing any of this accidentally? What we see is House Facet's doing, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It still begs the question why they would do something like this in the first place, Ludmilla said. To me, at least. How they've been able to get away with it for so long is difficult to grasp as well. One glance and you already know that something has gone terribly wrong. You can now, sure, Leanne replied, but in better days, the towns and villages along the highway can be made to look much the same as any other and, to be honest, there are more than a few places out west that are just as bad, or even worse. The king only came to Eranthal for one reason, to be there for the annual skirmish against the Empire. I doubt a review of his domain was anywhere near the top of his list of priorities. The provosts that were appointed managed things from a desk in the city. In short, you could say it's a matter of reach. Only a noble of the same court has any chance of bringing it to the attention of their liege. Without the means to provide decisive proof, however, it becomes the word of one noble against another. As for why they would do this, well, it's because they can. We are judge, jury and executioner within our own lands, answerable only to our own liege. I suppose you could say that we nobles may be placed on a scale. There are those that try their best to serve faithfully, promoting development and upholding order, then there are those that are entirely self-serving and get away with whatever they can. Those on the extreme ends of the scale are extraordinarily rare, most are somewhere in between, for any number of reasons. They may lack the power and will to do what is just, or have the power and will to do what is just, but decide to exercise it for their own interests. Did you know about all of this, Clara? Ludmilla asked. I understand how it works, roughly, Clara replied. When it comes to knowledge and experience on things that happen elsewhere, however, I can't make any statements with much conviction. Leanne, on the other hand, should know quite a lot about it. Why would Leanne? Because Leanne is Lady Wagner. Leanne shrugged, and House Wagner owns a half-dozen merchant companies, well, more now. Hundreds of merchant caravans, plus all of their employees. I get to hear all sorts of things about what goes on in the wide world, and not all of it is nice and pretty. I hope you weren't suspecting me of anything. I'd rather not get stabbed. It's difficult for me to suspect others like this, Ludmilla admitted. Even after all that's happened, these conclusions just don't easily come to mind. Thank you for being so patient with me, Leanne. It's not a bad frame of mind to have, Clara said, as long as one is also aware of what can potentially be going on. Without a balanced perspective, there would be no end to how far one could go in the pursuit of what we imagine. I'm sure we'll all learn a lot from this. Hopefully we'll figure out a way to effectively deal with House Facet as well. There's always Ludmilla's new duties, Florian said, whatever they are, but yes, a peaceful solution is best. Ludmilla agreed silently. She did not want to resort to extreme measures unless it became necessary. Doing so was the same as saying that the laws in place were insufficient. The more she relied on her new authority, the more likely it seemed that the laws would be viewed as unacceptable and torn apart. She needed as much information as possible, taking precise actions that would only result in minor amendments or special measures being implemented for what His Majesty had put in place. She felt that there was much more to be discussed, but it could wait until they started their investigation. Ludmilla turned to address the shadow demon, who had floated patiently before them the entire time. These men you encountered, she asked. What happened to them? They were made to suffer. A yellow gash appeared on its face as it smiled, before being slain. The Great Master's mandates are not to be frivolously disregarded. And the woman? She was allowed to flee, it replied. One of the others is watching her. Good, Ludmilla nodded. You may withdraw. There should be some new instructions soon, so stay nearby. The shadow demon shimmered briefly in the darkness as it concealed itself again, and Ludmilla's gaze followed it for a time before she turned back to the gathering. Peaceful solution, huh, Leanne said. You just killed 3 men, Florian said quietly. Ludmilla did not deny her words. Agents of the nobility carried out their will, after all. If anything, The reminder only served to fuel her anger against House Facet. If they were caught doing the same in our territories, Clara said, this would have been the result as well. Considering the condition of the boy, I'm of a mind that it was the most appropriate action, if only to intervene in abduction and murder. So this is the answer, then? Leanne's voice wavered in the wind, to find and hunt down every criminal in Facet County, until the undead start to appear from the mountain of corpses. We have a little under 2 weeks, Ludmilla replied, so I don't think there's time enough for that, not that I intended on doing what you suggested. I was hoping a demonstration that the Crown laws could no longer be evaded in such a manner would encourage House Facet to relent, but we'll need to find those that would impress this notion upon them first. So some sort of manager? Florine said, or, I don't know. How do these people even operate? They're merchants, Leanne shrugged, of a sort. Slavery is perfectly legal outside of the Sorceress Kingdom and Riestais, so it's simply just another part of a merchant's business to those who operate abroad. House Wagner doesn't do it, obviously, but it's just not something that's done in secrecy elsewhere. It would be a simple matter to shut down House Facet, if we had more time. Especially with Ludmilla suggesting that she can somehow act above the law. The head of House Wagner's words trailed off abruptly, and her icy blue gaze turned up towards Ludmilla. Are you sure you can do this? She said, this kind of power is dangerous. It's beyond dangerous, said Clara flatly, it's euphoric. Especially to people like us. My father once told me that blind righteousness can lead to ruin just as easily as rampant corruption. Now, there are 4 of us all together that hate what is going on here for the same reasons, Lou Camillo especially. If she were to exercise the authority she has been entrusted with without constraint, well, she is nothing if not thorough. They stared out over the town in silence at her words. A log broke and collapsed into the fire, sending a cloud of sparks into the night sky. It's not just Camilla, Clara added. I don't think I can fight this feeling either. Whenever I have someone responsible for all this in front of me, I become positively livid inside. I could barely maintain control over my own words when I spoke to the both of them. You heard me just now, I essentially told Jacqueline Facet that she was a dead woman at the end of our audience. I'm not confident that I can represent the House of Lords if condemnation spills out of my mouth every time I see one of the Facets. We're supposed to be helping them out of their predicament, not setting them at odds against us. It might just be something to get used to, Ludmilla offered. At least I hope it is something we can get used to, not that I enjoy it. You have a more measured disposition than my own, Clara. If anyone manages to rein this in, it would be you. You're still the most qualified to represent us here, besides. I can imagine the reception that someone of lower rank would get from them. Clara frowned worriedly upon hearing her vote of confidence. Maybe it isn't strange at all? Florine said, maybe there are other nobles out there that have the same sort of thing influencing them. It's not something one would talk about, would they? If I didn't have it myself, it would sound absolutely crazy. It's not even something to share, Leanne mused. We all inherently knew each of us were the same without putting it into words, shortly after we got to know one another. Perhaps others gather in the same way, nobles of the same disposition assembling naturally and influencing their subordinates. We don't exactly see tyrants purging great swathes of their own vassals for the sake of order, do we? We do, actually, Florine answered quietly. Just not in Riestais. Leanne's mouth opened, then closed again. No one wanted that repeated here. It was the worst possible outcome that they were trying to avoid. Let's not make grim monikers for ourselves, shall we? Clara said, the ideal outcome is that this land is restored to order in an agreeable manner and set on the path to recovery. I'm not so optimistic as to think that everything will fall into place so easily, even without our biases, but we must still make our best efforts. We're starting from a poor position. Both of our meetings with Campbell and Jacqueline only made them reciprocate by digging in their heels. It may take all the time we have to make them realize that they absolutely need to fall in line, or they may even remain stubborn to the bitter end. For this possibility, we will need to draw the line after which stronger measures are required to convince them, and, in the worst case, the line where we consider the situation unsalvageable. Ludmilla mulled over the available options, of which there were too few for the time being. They needed more information. She turned back to see if the girls had finished their dinner. She said, the children are falling asleep. The others turned at her words. Two of the girls, including the one that had spoken, were sleeping in their chairs with emptied trays in front of them. The third, however, was still picking at her meal. She looked hesitant to finish her food, and stole furtive glances at the carriages behind her. "Was it your brother that came with you?" Ludmilla asked as she came close and knelt in front of the girl. With wide eyes the color of clear topaz, the girl stared back at her. After a moment, she nodded. "The fellow that saved you told me what happened," Ludmilla said. "Your brother was very brave. We have treated his wounds, but he was quite badly injured, so he needs his rest. There will be food for him as well. You need not save a portion of your dinner for him." The flickering light from the flames nearby played across the girl's face as she seemed to weigh Ludmilla's words. Her silver fork moved to pick up the food on the plate before the girl and she resumed eating. "I am the one called Camilla," Ludmilla said. "How shall I call you?" "Say." The girl's fork paused, but she did not look up. "What about your brother?" "Liam." "Liam." Ludmilla smiled warmly. "That is a very troublesome name." "Why?" "A part of you should already know," she replied, "even if the rest of you does not quite yet. Make sure you take care of your brother, Say." Say nodded, and a fitful voice sounded nearby from one of the sleeping girls, turning Ludmilla's attention towards the sound. "Do you know these other girls as well, Say?" The girl shook her head. "I see," Ludmilla said, rising to her feet. "Well, once you are finished with your meal, we will take you back to your brother so you can watch over him. When he wakes up, just let one of the servants know and they will bring him his meal." "Okay." Ludmilla walked back over to the others. "We're not starting immediately, my lady?" Leluvian asked. "With the children?" "No," Ludmilla replied, "there are still other things to do besides. I'll have you and your sister learn to work together with the shadow demons first. You'll coordinate with them at night, Leluvian, and Willuvian will do so during the day. Use what you know as a base of knowledge from which to expand from, then we can weigh your findings along with what these children share with us after they've rested tonight." "Very good, my lady." Leluvian withdrew to wait on her once again. "Your maids are very close to you," Clara noted as Ludmilla rejoined them. "I only have 4 of them," Ludmilla replied. "You don't have any maids that are the same way?" "Not to the point where I openly plot the demise of a noble house together with them," Clara said with a slight laugh. "How are the children?" "The girl that was awake was worried about her brother," Ludmilla said. "The other 2 are sound asleep. Where are we putting them?" "There are plenty of spare things packed," Leanne said. "It shouldn't be a problem taking care of them. I'll have another tent prepared." "In that case," Ludmilla told them, "we should get our rest while we can as well. The coming week will be a busy one." With all that had happened over the past few weeks, Ludmilla had pushed many memories of her regular life away to focus on adjusting to all the changes that had occurred. Regular life inevitably returned, however, whether it was getting holes in her manor roof fixed, dealing with villager complaints or finding a new hole in her stockings. This time, it was in the form of the clingy sleeper that was Clara Corlin. With her lack of sleep from the previous day, memories of the past did not even cross her mind. She crawled into their carriage, undressed, and passed out on the spacious and comfortable bed its interior had been converted into. Not that the amount of space mattered. With the morning light filtering through the drapes, Ludmilla awoke to find herself thoroughly tangled up with Clara. If it was midsummer, the heat would have had Ludmilla throw her friend off in the middle of the night. But, with the chill of spring still settling over them in the night, she had slept right through to the morning in their 2 luxurious accommodations. Rather than try to untangle herself, she poked Clara in the forehead. The first try didn't work, so she poked her again. They were both late sleepers and risers, and she knew that they were usually up around the same times of the day. Then again, her friend was far busier than she was. The size of her domain had increased tenfold with her promotion, and Ludmilla could not imagine how she managed. The village and a half in her own barony kept her continually occupied as it was. Maybe she should let Clara rest a while longer. The shadows of the household servants passing back and forth in the camp as they worked could be seen over obscured windows, and a pair stopped outside of the door. A silver bell chimed lightly in the corner of the carriage and Ludmilla froze as Clara stirred slightly at her shoulder, softly murmuring in her ear. She needed to get away. Untangling one leg was the most she could accomplish before the bell chimed a second time. "I'm up already." Clara's voice thundered straight into her ear, and Ludmilla's head rang in the aftermath. Did she just use an ability to amplify her voice? She felt her ear with her hand, it did not come away with any blood, then turned her head to glower at her friend, who was clearly still asleep with a satisfied smile on her face and an arm over Ludmilla's midriff. Baroness Saradnik sat up in their bed, and Countess Corlin continued to cling to her like a giant forest leech. Perhaps it should be comforting that some things never changed. 15 minutes later, Ludmilla finally escaped from her friend's clutches. Clara's lady's maid and Willoughby awaited outside. Though the carriage was magically soundproofed, Clara's maid still offered an apologetic smile. "Good morning, my lady," Willoughby greeted her. "Good morning, Willoughby," Ludmilla replied. "How are we doing?" Little of note has occurred overnight. The half-elf chambermaid fell in behind her. After setting up a tent for our work, Loluvian has been able to survey most of the town with the 2 shadow demons not assigned to watch over the camp. She left her reports in the pavilion before retiring for the day. Facet town was relatively small as far as county capitals went, but it still had a population of nearly 2,000. The Lynham sisters had certainly hurled themselves at their task with incredible zeal. "What happened to the woman that was being tailed?" Ludmilla asked. "She seemed to have run straight home rather than to anywhere important," Willoughby said. "We had the free shadow demon check up on the other, and it reported that the woman had fallen asleep. Ludmilla thought it would be a better use of our time to have both collecting information from the town after that." "I see," Ludmilla said. "How are you and your sister feeling? It can't be nice returning to this place." "It is as you say, my lady," Willoughby said after a moment's pause, "but we're still thankful that you've brought us along. To have the opportunity to be of use to you here against House Facet is like a salve after being so powerless for so long. The chance to find our mother is a great motivation as well." "She wasn't in Jacqueline's manor, I take it?" "No, my lady," Willoughby shook her head. Loluvian ordered the manor scoured for anything useful first. The shadow demons came away with some information on House Facet, but there was no sign of our mother there. Ludmilla had not spotted any elf servants with Campbell Facet either. Hopefully Mrs. Lynham could still be found somewhere in the county. They came to a set of tables placed inside the semicircle of tents and carriages. Used to transporting goods and people for long distances and offering high-class accommodations for their passengers, House Wagner employed various magical items that revolved around its trading and transport businesses. The table was lined with containers, and each was enchanted to preserve the temperature and quality of the meal that it contained. Multiple meals were prepared beforehand and taken at the leisure of their guests, who were able to enjoy fresh, hot meals on demand at any time of the day. Beverages were also kept ready in crystal decanters enchanted with the same magic, so refreshments both hot and cold were available as well. According to Leanne, they even transported perishable cargo using a scaled-up version of the same concept. It was an idea that Ludmilla wanted to explore at some point for use in her own domain. Picking up a box that was labeled with something that wouldn't leave her hungry for the rest of the morning, she made her way to the pavilion near the overlook. There, she found Leanne and Florine discussing something as they ate breakfast together. "Early risers both, I see." Ludmilla found a seat at their table, which was set just outside the pavilion to offer a view of the surroundings. A much larger wooden table had been put together in the middle of the pavilion, where a map had been laid out and several documents rested. "We both slept in, actually," Leanne replied. "I'm usually up with the sun, Florine's running around even earlier. Too much excitement for one day, maybe." "The two of you are the complete opposite of us," Ludmilla said as she lifted the cover of her meal. "We usually stay up well into the night." "We found that out about Clara a few weeks ago," Florine said. "We showed up for breakfast and ended up having lunch instead. It's a surprise to find that you're the same, though. I thought life on the border would mean that you're even more bound to the daylight towers than we are." "Not necessarily," Ludmilla replied. "Many demi-humans are nocturnal, so vigilance is required at all hours. It is true that most of the villagers who are not on watch and patrol duties rely on daylight, however. As for myself, I think I've always preferred evenings over mornings." As she set into her meal of sausage, scrambled eggs, toast and some sort of mixed salad, she noticed that they had been going over several of the reports that had been put together overnight. Each parchment was filled with numbered paragraphs in neat and angular handwriting. "You've started going over the findings so far?" Ludmilla asked.
"Yes."
Leanne shifted in her seat slightly. "It's unsettling, in more ways than we initially expected."
"How do you mean?"
"Well," Leanne said, "at first I was astonished at how quickly and thoroughly these notes are being put together. Your chambermaid was able to create a new map of the town, and each building is marked and detailed on these notes with their appearance, general layout, notable inhabitants and contents that may be of interest." Leanne picked up a folder containing several dozen sheets of paper. She withdrew the documents and placed them on the center of their table. "This is one of the summaries of the information retrieved from the manor overlooking the town," she said. "It indexes documents and ledgers that have been copied and filed away for us to sift through later. While much of what was discovered runs vaguely along the lines of our expectations, all the information flowing in made me realize something else. House Facet, this town, they are utterly defenseless against these shadow demons, and so are we." "We asked your maid how they were able to accomplish all of this," Florine said, and what she described beggared belief. "These shadow demons fly around, and can jump from shadow to shadow. They can seep through walls, doors, floors and ceilings. Even locked cabinets and safes are no obstacle, and they can just as simply appear into the darkness inside enclosed spaces, take what they want, and come back out. It's enough to make me want to check under my bed for monsters again, like when I was a child." "If the Sorcerer's Kingdom so desired," Leanne gestured with her soup spoon, "the private information of anyone, even the dealings of an entire domain, can be laid bare on a whim as long as it can be observed or stolen by a shadow demon. There is no fortress or vault that is safe, and, even when I'm actively keeping an eye out for them as they go back and forth between the camp and the town, I can't see them unless they reveal themselves to us on purpose. I'm not suggesting that we have any illicit activities to hide, but confidentiality in business is valued by both ourselves and our clients. It also should not be left unsaid that they can plant information just as easily as they can steal it. It comes down to a matter of trust, does it not?" Ludmilla said. "Never mind such convoluted means, the royal court can crush all of us with force alone if they so desired. The old politics, where nobles constantly maneuver in games of intrigue and influence, no longer carry the same weight in the dynamics of the realm. His Majesty has no fear of disapproval or rebellion, so there is no motive for these sorts of actions on the part of the Sorcerer King." "I suppose you're right." Leanne did not look pleased with the admission, "but we don't enjoy the same relationship with our liege as you do with yours. Lady Shiltier at least interacts with you from time to time, and this personal duty she has bestowed on you implies some degree of shared trust." "We have not seen His Majesty since, Gem." Leanne looked to Florine with an unspoken question on her face. The younger noblewoman thought for a moment. "I heard His Majesty was seen on the 1st of the month, walking around the city," Florine said. "As far as audiences go, however, I haven't heard of any. Since his last appearance, he hasn't been seen at all. I was in my rural manor when he formally came to claim Erantal, and he wasn't present the few times I've had an audience with the royal court." "It's the same for me," said Leanne. "I don't even know what His Majesty looks like. You'd think that conquerors would be putting up statues and monuments marking their achievements all over the place, but I guess not." It occurred to Ludmilla that she did not know what the Sorcerer King looked like either. Neither did Clara, as far as she knew. "If not for the annual skirmish with the Empire," Ludmilla said, "I don't think King Ramposa would have visited Erantal either. It's only been 2 months, and this duchy has always been distant from its ruler. Given how powerful the Sorceress Kingdom is, Erantal must amount to an outpost of some incredible empire beyond this region's awareness." "That's probably why we don't feel that anything is out of place," Leanne said, "but it would still mean a lot to us if we had some personal reassurances from our liege." "According to Lady Shiltier," Ludmilla said, "His Majesty has not even been in the duchy for the past 3 weeks. So rather than avoiding his vassals on purpose, perhaps he's just that busy?" "Well, he did bring the Empire to heel before anyone even noticed his absence," Florine said. "Then there's the dragons that recently appeared. No one could claim that His Majesty has simply been evading his duties in favor of lazing about or chasing after some self-indulgent whim. Maybe it's just us, everything's been so unexpected and sudden and we're not used to our titles yet. Though, despite all that's happened, we still often wish there was someone we could look to for guidance. Florian had a point. While Ludmilla did not harbor those feelings much anymore, she would have if she was younger. It was something that she would need to speak to Clara about. With everyone acting as the heads of their respective houses, it was easy to forget that Leanne and Florian were still at a point in their lives where they would still normally depend on their parents and mentors. While she often hounded her own siblings and even her father about administrative matters, Ludmilla was still the youngest in her family. Clara was the youngest in her family as well, so neither she nor Ludmilla had considered the idea that Florian and Leanne were essentially their younger sisters in this little social circle and might depend on them as such. "Ara," said a voice from behind them, "you can depend on us a bit, you know." Clara appeared with her lady's maid, who was carrying breakfast along for her mistress. They had clearly taken the time to prepare for the day. Clara's lustrous blonde hair shimmered in the late morning sun, and she was adorned tastefully with silks dyed and embroidered in house Corlin's cobalt and silver. The clingy sleeper in her rumpled nightwear had transformed into a beautiful young noblewoman adorned for a garden stroll, her amethyst eyes bright with charismatic allure. As Clara seated herself beside her, Ludmilla could not help but wonder about how they appeared next to one another. She had thrown on a plain outfit and roughly brushed out her hair before escaping their carriage and had meandered over to the pavilion after very little in the way of her own preparations. "Good morning, Countess Corlin," the two girls greeted Clara simultaneously, lowering their heads slightly. Ludmilla looked down and stabbed the last piece of breakfast sausage with her fork. "Good morning," Clara replied with a beatific smile. "You've rested well, I hope." "Oh yes," Florian replied. "I don't think I've slept this soundly for weeks. Quite strange, considering the circumstances." "House Wagner's carriages are remarkably luxurious," Clara said, "so it's no surprise. I certainly plan on hiring her services for any sort of extended trip after experiencing them myself." Leanne tried to maintain a straight face, but the corners of her mouth kept turning up at the praise. "Anyways," Ludmilla said, "we have a lot to examine before deciding how to lay out our strategy for House Fassett. Did you have any thoughts based on the discussions with Campbell and Jacqueline yesterday?" "Well," Clara said, "I cannot say we didn't expect this sort of initial reception. Both are adamant in their positions, they are truly siblings in how they carry themselves, which is unfortunate. I was really hoping to find a way to reach out to at least one of them despite knowing what we were going into. The feeling they give off as well, needless to say, it's a challenge to be cordial in the face of such dispositions, but I'll do my best to be diplomatic when I interact with them." What we came up with over the course of yesterday still comes down to twisting their arms until they give in, though, Ludmilla said. "The only apparent options seem to involve doing just that." "Yes," Clara replied, "it's not an elegant solution, but it might be the only thing we can do to convince them to relent. Let's not give up just yet, though, we've only just begun our work."